In this video, I want to talk about some of the options we have when creating a render. You can find your options from your Render Tools tab or from your PhotoView 360 dropdown under Options. The first thing I want to talk about is Dynamic Help. Dynamic Help is available in many of the SOLIDWORKS tools, and it really helps you figure out what certain things do at certain points in the design phase. Now, when we're dealing with render outputs, there are a few things that we need to be aware of. The first of which is the output image size. Now, if you're trying to get a full HD output, a 16 by 9 at 1920 by 1080, that's fine. But if you're doing intermediate renders and you're trying to get your scene just right, the lighting just right, and the preview window just isn't giving you the final detail that you need, it's a good idea to reduce the overall output size. Something like 640 by 360 will still give you the same aspect ratio, but you're not rendering as much material or as much information in as high of a detail. So this will render much quicker than the full 1920 by 1080. This really helps in those intermediate stages when you're trying to figure everything out and not spend all the time waiting for a full size render when the output, the image that you're looking for, isn't quite there yet. The next thing I want to talk about is the image format. Most people will output a JPEG by default, but you have a lot of options here. So if you need a different format, for instance, a PNG or maybe even a TIFF, you can select those options directly from your PhotoView 360 options. Then we can select the default image path. If you want to save it to a certain path, you can, or you can select your default here for things like rendering from a motion study or different aspects of the design phase. The next step is selecting your render quality. Now you'll notice that there are two options here. There's a preview render quality and there's a final render quality. Now, it's a good idea, depending on what you're doing and how complex your model is and your lighting and whether or not you have fog or additional lights and so on, to play around with some of these options. The preview render, again, isn't going to give you the same level of detail. In most cases, there are certain things that only happen in the final render phase. So I usually leave my preview render at good or better. And at different stages, especially if I'm doing smaller size renders, even in my 16 by 9 format size, I might change my final render quality to good until I'm ready to do that full size final output image. And then I'll go to either best or maximum. And this is because these options take longer. The final render quality with a higher output is going to take longer. And depending on your computer specs, the complexity of your scene, whether or not you have additional lighting or fog, or if you're dealing with direct caustics and bloom and so on, these things take a lot of time. So it's important to take off small chunks and figure out where you can tweak your scene, get your lighting just right. And then for your final renders, come back in, set them to your final qualities, your final sizes, and go from there. We also have a gamma output, and this is basically the brightness of the overall scene. Now, 1.6 is the standard number it comes in at. I don't usually go brighter than 1.6. I might actually go darker down to a 1.2, 1.1, depending on what the environment is and what I'm trying to do. Most of the time, I'll only adjust the gamma when I'm dealing with a preloaded SOLIDWORKS scene, something like one of the default scenes in our basic arena. If we're looking at a 3 point or maybe one of the white rooms, I might lower that gamma number so I have a little bit better contrast. But for the most part, you'll leave that at 1.6 and you won't have to touch it too much. The next section is bloom. Bloom is important depending on what your product is. Now you'll notice with dynamic help turned on, it gives you a few images to show you the difference here. And it's basically the brightness or the level at which your object is going to be emitting light or reflecting that light. So if you need a brighter looking object, more of a halo effect around it, then you can see that the higher number, the higher set point gives you that higher bloom look to it. And there's also a bloom extents. This is basically how far it radiates from the source. These are two things that can affect the output. The next section is contour and cartoon rendering. Cartoon rendering is something that's been added fairly recently to SOLIDWORKS, and it's pretty nice depending on what your product is and what your desired output is going to be. So you'll notice that we have cartoon and we have contour options. The contour options we have are render only with contours, which will basically do a wire outline of your product, or you can do the render option that gives you the rendered image behind it and then the contours are overlaid. Now, it's important to note that when you do the second option here, when you're dealing with the rendered contours and the solid model, you still have all that time that goes into rendering the scene. So, if you have all these extensive lighting effects, very reflective materials, or transparent, translucent materials, these renders are going to take quite a bit longer. And you're still going to have to go through that process. If you do just the line render, it happens quite a bit quicker. Then you also have some line thickness options and then the line color options. When we go to a cartoon render, we have a few options. We can do the just cartoon edges, we can do just the cartoon shading, and then we can do shading and edges. And then again, we have a line thickness and line color. Again, this really depends on what your product is and what your expected output is or desired output is. Not everybody will use contour and cartoon rendering, but a lot of times, especially with more detailed components, if you're trying to do a nicer looking image for technical documentation or something along those lines, these can be very handy tools. The next section is direct caustics. This is something that is very important, especially if you're dealing with reflective metals. As you can see, the preview there has more of a gold or a brass metal. It really can have a drastic effect on the realism of your final render. One thing you can see in the small preview windows, it's the amount of visible caustics in the scene. It's basically a fancy word for the photons fired in the scene. And that has a direct correlation to what you see in terms of the light and the reflection and how that is applied to the rest of your scene, especially a floor or other materials that are maybe a matte or a flat color. If you're dealing with shiny plastics or you're dealing with these reflective metals, so one of the polished metals, whether it's aluminum or gold or brass or whatever the case is, it's important to look at the caustics. Now, if you're doing intermediate renders at lower quality and lower size, I would typically leave bloom and direct caustics off because these things do add a bit of time to the overall render. So if you're trying to narrow things down, turn these off, make the render size smaller, quality a little bit less to make sure that your overall scene and everything looks right. And then you can start playing with these and turning them on and looking at what the settings are doing. I highly suggest that you use render region when you're talking about some of these, and render region we'll talk about in its own video as well. The last thing in this section that we want to talk about in terms of our PhotoView 360 options is the network rendering. This is a great option if you work in a network environment and you're using your renders at night, or maybe when there's not a lot of computer load. When you install SOLIDWORKS or when your IT professional installs SOLIDWORKS, there is an option to install a network rendering client. That's very important because without that, this functionality doesn't work. But if you're working on large scenes, maybe a very high level of detail, or maybe it's just an individual small component, but it has a lot of detail, you want to use some of these options for direct caustics and bloom, and you're using fog and extra lighting and highly reflective materials and so on, things that take a lot of processing power when you're rendering, it's a good idea to try to share that workload across multiple machines. So, if you're working in those types of environments, if you're always making these detailed renders with the high quality settings, look into network rendering, see if that's an available option for you in whatever environment you're in. If you can share it across multiple machines, that can make these renders happen so much faster. So, it's a very handy thing.